Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse, all famous musicians who died young at the peak of their careers. But they also share something else in common. They were all 27 years old when they passed. And this connection has led many people to ask the question, are famous musicians somehow more susceptible to dying at 27 than at any other age? And from this, the idea of the 27 Club was born. An informal list mostly made up of famous musicians, but also includes celebrities of other fields, and all of whom have died at 27. But is there any truth behind it? Like, is there some sort of supernatural power at work here? Well, in this video, we're going to dive into the history of the club and uncover possible explanations in order to determine if the phenomenon is fact or fiction. This is the mystery of the 27 Club. It's my belief that the 27 Club first rose to prominence during the early 1970s after a string of back-to-back tragic deaths of famous musicians, starting in 1969 with the co-founder of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones. He was found dead in his pool, but because his death was about a month after his very public departure from the band, and the fact that he was a strong swimmer and yet he drowned, it didn't make a lot of sense. And so some people started to think that, something else was going on. Like, this wasn't just an accident. This had to be done on purpose. And from these suspicions, wild theories began to circulate, claiming that he was murdered, and perhaps even associates of the Rolling Stones were behind it. The next year, in 1970, Jimi Hendrix died from drug and alcohol-related causes, but many of the details of his last day and the events leading up to his death are still disputed. Even his girlfriend at the time gave conflicting reports to the police and claimed to be in the ambulance when his body was taken to the hospital. But the medics on scene said no one was in the apartment when they found his body. Then, just 2 weeks after Jimi's passing, Janis Joplin died in her Los Angeles hotel room. The coroner later concluded that she died from an accidental heroin overdose and that alcohol may have played a factor. But her close friend insists that Janis died from a head injury when her high heels got caught on the shag carpet of her room. The drugs and alcohol in her system probably contributed to her losing her balance, and so she fell, striking her head on the nightstand, breaking her nose, and she suffocated. Then on July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison passed away. His cause of death was heart failure, even though no autopsy was performed, and his death wasn't reported for 6 days. This led to theories that he was murdered or that he faked his death, but what's weird is that we know that the very same drug dealer who was rumored to have sold the lethal dose to Janis Joplin was romantically involved with Jim's girlfriend, and he may have provided the drugs that ultimately led to Jim's death. And even stranger is the fact that Jim's girlfriend would also die at 27, just 3 years after him. But the craziest connection for me is that Jim died on the same day as Brian Jones, just 2 years later. By 1973, over 10 famous musicians passed away at 27 within a 5-year period, and newspapers started taking notice. Articles were published trying to understand why so many young musicians were dying. Even Geraldo Rivera devoted a whole 90-minute episode of his TV show to covering the untimely deaths of rock stars. And guess who he talked about? 4 members of the 27 Club. After so many media outlets started grouping these musicians together and listing their ages, people started seeing a pattern emerge, and one that just seemed too consistent to be a coincidence. So I think you can see how the 27 Club started to develop, but even so, it didn't catch mainstream attention until the death of Kurt Cobain in 1994. After the news of his passing broke, Kurt's mom was quoted in a local newspaper saying, "Now he's gone and joined that stupid club." The story was picked up nationally, and many journalists thought she was referring to the 27 Club. In an eerie coincidence, just months after Kurt's death, Kristen Pfaff, the bassist for Kurt's wife's band Hole, also died at 27 from a drug overdose. Then in 2008, Amy Winehouse's former personal assistant told a UK tabloid newspaper that Amy feared she would join the 27 Club, adding that she said, "I have a feeling I'm gonna die young." And she wasn't the only one. In 2007, the tasteless website whenwillamywinehouse.die.com launched, and it asked users to predict when she was going to die, and the winner would receive an iPod Touch device. Sadly, 4 people got it right when Amy passed away at 27 on the 23rd of July, 2011. But after her death, interest in the club skyrocketed. I mean, just look at the Google Trends data. You can see a huge spike for searches of the 27 Club in July of that year. Almost overnight, there were hundreds of articles written on the club and even books published on the subject. Eventually, an extensive list was added on the Wikipedia page that included musicians that died before the club's emergence. The list was also opened up to include anyone with some level of celebrity. In the years since Amy's passing, the club rose in popularity and started becoming the song inspiration for other musicians. Some notable examples include that tragically in 2015, Mac Miller rapped that he didn't want to join the 27 Club in his song Brand Name, and he later passed away at the age of 26. In a sad but similar fate, rapper Juice WRLD's 2018 single Legends contains the lyrics, "What's the 27 Club? We ain't making it past 21. His words would later prove prophetic when he passed away at 21 from a drug overdose. On Frank Ocean's 2016 song Nights, he raps, "No white lighters till I F my 28th up." Now, he's referring to the curse of the white Bic lighter, which is sort of an explanation for the 27 Club. So the earliest mention of this comes from a 2011 post on the site highideas.com, and it claims that having a white Bic disposable lighter is associated with bad luck. They do explain that because of the white bottom of the lighter, it shows ash from packing a marijuana bowl, and then police will know that you've been smoking weed and they'll give you a hard time. They further explain that each member of the 27 Club was found with one when they died. Now, it's hard to say when this idea first started, but I'm guessing it was around the time of Kurt's death, since a Bic lighter was found in a cigar box full of other drug paraphernalia near his body. The only problem with this is that Bic didn't start producing disposable lighters until 1973, well after the deaths of the Big Four. Another problem is that when the Seattle Police Department released photos from Kurt's death, it showed that the lighter in the box was multicolored and a second one found nearby was pink. So, if white lighters aren't the cause, what else could it be? Now, some people believe there's some kind of mystical connection between the members, and so they look to astrology for an explanation. Now, there's the notion that at the age of 27 is significant because it's right before Saturn returns to your astrological chart. And it's said that at 28, you take your first steps into becoming an adult. And so the time right before that is marked with turmoil as it's a transitional period. And so it could mean that the members couldn't make the transition on a cosmic level, and so they passed away. There's also the fact that the moon takes just over 27 days to orbit the Earth, 27.3 to be exact. And in Hindu Vedic astrology, there are 27 homes that the moon rests in as it travels through the zodiac each month. The 27th one is named Revati, and it can mean wealthy or to transcend. But this is also the time in the phase of the moon when it's almost completely shrouded in darkness. So you could see this to mean at 27, a wealthy, famous musician is about to transcend into adulthood, but this could be a dark time for them as the transition can be difficult and they might not make it. In numerology, when you add 2 and 7, you get 9, which represents an ending or completion of a cycle and the start of a new one. Also interesting, 3 times 3 is 9, and 9 times 3 is 27, and 3 is associated with creative thinking and expression, something that all the members have in common. Going further, 27 consists of a 2 and a 7, with 2 representing being in harmony or in balance, whereas 7 deals with spirituality and intuition, wisdom, and introspection. And if you apply all this to the members of the club, you could interpret this to mean that they passed away because they were unable to find harmony within themselves before the start of their next life phase. If we look to religion, in Buddhism, 27 is the highest level of spiritual attainment in the material world. And you could interpret this to mean that the members of the 27 Club attained all they could from the material world and ascended into the spiritual world. In Islam, the 27th of Rajab in the Islamic calendar celebrates when the Prophet Muhammad ascended into the heavens and returned. Additionally, many believe the Night of Power occurs on the 27th day of Ramadan, and this is one of the most, if not the most important nights in Islam, as it commemorates when the Quran was first revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. And both of these dates add to the idea that the age of 27 is a time of great change and transition. In Christianity, there are 27 books of the New Testament, and the 27th one is the Book of Revelation. Now, there's a bunch of different interpretations for this book, but If we speak in broad terms, it deals with the ongoing struggle between good and evil. So it's easy to see how this applies to the members of the 27 Club. Many of them were struggling with addiction and personal demons, while others suffered from mental health issues or were simply unable to cope with the pressures of fame. So you could interpret this to mean that there's an internal struggle between good and evil, and when someone is 27, they are more susceptible to losing that battle. Going further, Jacob Boehm, a German philosopher and theologian from the 1600s, created a religious cosmology as a way to illustrate how all aspects of nature are interconnected and reflect higher spiritual realities. He assigned numbers to different aspects of life and religion and somehow landed on the number 27 to represent death. But here's the creepy part. He goes on to warn that if we act like Adam from the Bible and pursue earthly ambitions, we fall into anguish, referred to as number 26, and are destined to experience death where, and I quote, his body must be consumed in the mystery. We can interpret this to mean by seeking out a rock and roll lifestyle, you open yourself up to a mysterious death. But even more extreme, some people believe that the members of the 27 Club sold their soul to the devil in exchange for their success, and that the devil comes to collect when they turn 27. In fact, Amy Winehouse publicly blamed the devil for her drug addiction during a recording session in 2008, but I'm fairly certain this idea goes all the way back to blues musician Robert Johnson and his song Crossroad Blues. So the legend goes, Robert wanted to be a famous blues musician, and he was instructed to take his guitar to a crossroad near his hometown in Mississippi at midnight and wait. The devil arrived, tuned his guitar, played a few songs, and then gave it back to him, which also gave him mastery over the instrument. And this seemed to align with his seemingly overnight proficiency on the guitar by those who knew him. Way back in the day when he first left his hometown, he was an average guitar player, but when he returned a few years later, he was phenomenal. People joked that he must have sold his soul. But here's the interesting part. While his song Crossroad Blues makes no mention of the devil, two of his later songs do. Hellhound on My Trail talks of trying to stay ahead of a devil hound that is after him, and in the song Me and the Devil Blues, Robert sings, "Early this morning when you knocked upon my door, and I said, 'Hello, Satan, I believe it's time to go.'" Robert passed away in 1938 at the age of 27, which seems to align with this theory. Also, no cause of death was reported, and it remains a mystery to this day. Now, there's some speculation that a jealous husband poisoned Robert after he flirted with his wife, but we'll never know for sure. One thing we do know, however, is that his association with selling his soul to the devil is wrong. As it turns out, it was another blues musician, Tommy Johnson, no relation to Robert, who first claimed to have sold his soul to the devil. In fact, he used to brag about it, and he was 60 years old when he died. So I think it's safe to say that this explanation doesn't really hold up. Which brings us to the fact that while all the mystical and religious connections are really compelling, they ultimately don't offer a definitive explanation for the phenomenon we see. So maybe science can offer an answer. If we boil this thing down, the basis of the club rests on the notion that there's something statistically significant about the age of 27. Like somehow a famous young person is more likely to die at that age than at any other. And there's some truth to this, since the 20s can be a very turbulent time in one's life with lots of change and growth. And when you combine that with the unpredictable nature of fame, it can become very hard to cope with all of the above. Unfortunately, many in the 27 Club turn to drugs or alcohol as a way to deal with the stress and pressures of fame, but often those habits ultimately played a factor in their untimely deaths. A 2007 study on the early mortality of pop and rock stars found that the leading cause of premature death was drug or alcohol overdose, followed closely by cancer, heart disease, and accidents. So while substance abuse is a leading factor, it's not the cause for everyone. Fame itself can also play a role. That same 2007 study found that a rock star is 70% more likely to die early than an average person. And this risk is 240% higher in the first 5 years of fame. But here's the thing, there's been multiple scientific studies on the phenomenon, and none of them have found a significant increase in musician deaths at the age of 27. In fact, a 2011 scientific study found similar death rates at the ages of 25 and 32. Another study from 2014 looked at a sample of over 11,000 musicians from all popular genres who died between the years of 1950 and 2014 and found that 144 musicians died at 27. However, that study concluded that this was not enough of a statistical anomaly to justify the existence of the 27 Club. In other words, if the 27 Club was true, the actual number of deaths would need to be much higher. In fact, the study found that musicians are statistically more likely to die at 56 than at any other age. So despite the club's notoriety, there's no evidence to suggest that their deaths are linked in any way. And it's true in general, famous musicians are more likely to die young than the general population. They just aren't more likely to die at 27. There just isn't anything particularly significant about that age. So that's it. The whole thing turns out it was just a myth. But wait a minute. What about those back-to-back deaths of Jones, Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison? That's got to mean something, right? Well, actually, it does. A 2024 research paper stated that those 4 deaths, all within a 2-year period and at the same age, was statistically improbable. The odds of something like that happening is 1 in 100,000. And if that wasn't compelling enough, the paper goes on to say this is what caused the club in the first place. The researchers looked at over 300,000 famous dead people listed on Wikipedia and found no increased risk of dying at 27, but they did find that those who did die at that age received significantly more public attention. This increased visibility has a strange effect. People are more likely to encounter those who die at 27 than at other young ages, even if they're not aware of the myth. This in turn creates the appearance of a greater risk of mortality at 27. In other words, the 27 Club is real, but only because we collectively willed it into being. The 27 Club persists today because the coincidence is just so convincing and alluring. We love to see patterns and randomness and look for meaning in unrelated events, and the number 27 just stands out to us. It's literally and figuratively an odd number. On top of this, many of the members of the 27 Club created some of our favorite pieces of music, so it's not hard to be affected by their young deaths. We feel their lives were cut short and we want some sort of meaning. And while it's fun to talk about the club and get all wrapped up in the mystery and eerie coincidences, it's important to remember that these were real people, many of whom were fighting personal demons and lost. I think it's important that we find a balance that honors their legacies in a way that doesn't glamorize or romanticize their tragic deaths. And look, I get it. Because I made this video, I have a hand in perpetuating the myth and sensationalizing the members' deaths. But the fact of the matter remains, the 27 Club exists whether or not I make this video. And if I can give it some context and meaning, then I think that's worth something. Ultimately, my only real issue with the club is that it excludes countless other brilliant and influential musicians who died young, but just not at the age of 27. And so in the end, the 27 Club is the result of a highly improbable change of notable back-to-back deaths that is really just a strange coincidence. There's nothing unique about that age, nor do famous people have a higher risk of dying at 27 versus any other time in their 20s. The truth of the 27 Club is that it's a myth. That all being said, there is a real 27 Club that you can join while you're alive, but only if you're a man. The Verdi Enthusiast Club of the 27 was formed in 1958 by fans of the 19th century Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi. There are only 27 members, one for each of Verdi's operas, and the only way you can join is if a current member dies. So if you love opera, you may want to look into becoming a member. Alright everybody, that will do it for today's video. Be sure to let me know if you still believe in the 27 Club and who your favorite member is. If you're interested in learning more about finding patterns and randomness, be sure to check out my video on the dark side of the rainbow. In it, I explore the strange phenomenon of how The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd lines up almost perfectly with the Wizard of Oz film. Or for more music conspiracy theories, watch my video on the Paul is Dead conspiracy that took place in 1969. And the crazy part is, Paul McCartney was 27 when people thought he was dead. Until then, I want to thank you all so much for watching, but I especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.